this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Li O11 Vision. This is a new case in collaboration with PC Master Race, which basically takes the tried and trusted O11 design and throws in more glass. You'll see that you now have a glass top panel as well as obviously the front and side panels, giving you a better view inside the case and more RGB. If you're throwing that in there, you can see I have dabbled in some here. This has some highlights and lowlights to it, so I want to talk to you about what is good and bad about this case in my mind, as I have built in it, as you can see, with a 240mm NZXT radiator and a number of AL120 fans. Now, one of the really cool things about this case is how easy it is to take it apart. It's quite modular in the way that you can deconstruct it to build in it, and this makes it quite flexible in the build process, which makes life a little bit easier in terms of the setup and the overall installation of your components, which is really nice. I will say that it's nowhere near as modular as the Dynamic Evo, so although you can take it apart, it's not as flexible in terms of the setup and what you can do and where you can put things, but there are some highlights to it. You can see I've basically stripped it down to nothingness here. You can take off a lot of the panels, including all the glass, even though you don't need to for the build process. So that front glass panel I've taken off, for example, the manual says not to do that you don't have to, but you can do that. You can remove obviously the rear panels, the SSD tray, and all sorts of other things just to access all the different areas. But this I want to show you is how flexible it can be in terms of opening it up and then having access to it. There are also some other interesting highlights. You'll notice, for example, that the SSD tray is missing there, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the curiosities of it is the setup of the fans. So you can see that you can have 320mm fans on the side and on the bottom, or alternatively 240mm fans on the side and 3 on the bottom up to. So if you have those, then you can do that. And rad mounting, really you're going to have a 360mm radiator on the side of the case, and you can do that with push-pull, or alternatively up to a 240mm radiator at the rear. So what I've done here is 6 intake fans with 120mm setup and then the 240mm radiator exhausting at the rear. So maybe not as flexible in terms of the sort of radiator mounting options and what you're going to do there. It's going more for the aesthetics than the airflow, whereas if you look at something like the Dynamic Evo XL, that had a lot more options and where you could mount radiators. Obviously you could do it at the top, you could do push-pull setups and more. You can do push-pull in this. There is enough space at the back of the case, so you could side mount a 360mm radiator and then do intake at the bottom and then just have exhaust fans at the rear. So there are a couple of different options in what you can do, but it's nowhere near as flexible. However, that said, as you can see, it looks really nice. Now here it is alongside the Dynamic Evo XL, which probably doesn't do it justice because that is set back a bit. That thing is a little bit bigger, and you can see it here against a 27-inch monitor just for reference. So it's not huge, but it definitely is very nice looking from multiple angles, as you've seen, and certainly not a bad case to have alongside you, and it doesn't seem to get too hot or too loud. In my testing, it was running nice and cool and quiet, and so it should be good enough. So going back to the sort of setup of it, I want to talk about some of the things here that are interesting. Loads of plastic peel for a start that you're going to have to peel off, and obviously you will notice immediately with this glass top panel there's no front bar supporting it along the side as you would have normally, so instead you have this little notch at the front there, and they say the magnets for this corner are rated up to 35 kilos of force as well for strong support on that edge. But what you will notice is we do have some white marks in here, so there's like stickers but they're not removable because it's covering over these notches and latches here that are obviously that support point. So it's an important point that has to be there still, otherwise that'd be an eyesore. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So it's not fully complete glass over there. On the underside you do have a large removable dust tray, and those trays are fantastic. Same sort of logic as with the Dynamic Evo, so you can pull that out and keep your fans nice and clean. And then as you've seen, just everything's removable. Now the front glass panel is a little bit trickier to remove because you have to remove an internal screw, some side screws, and you have to take the back panel off, and you have to unscrew multiple screws at there, and that then pops off the front power button and that panel, and then you have to do more screws. So it does become a bit of a faff, and it isn't necessary to do the build, but I did it because I wanted to show how to do it and also to be able to access things a bit more easily when doing the build process. So I'm going to do a full in-depth build guide on this case. If you want to see that, subscribe if you haven't already, and that'll be a lot longer and more detailed on all the different things to know. But I wanted to show some of the highlights here. At the rear, the usual sort of setup with a Lian Li case, obviously dual chamber design, plenty of space for cables, nice hooks in there, but some other new things that I really like as well, or some interesting thought that's gone into it. You'll see, for example, that there's this removable PSU shroud at the back, so that part of it basically juts out from the rear of the case, which means that some of the length of the power supply unit is outside the case rather than inside it, which then obviously frees up space for your cabling, which is interesting and again makes it quite flexible. The SSDs and hard disk drive bays, you can see here, can also be removed, although there are 2 thumb screws and then 3 screws per cage, so they do require a little bit of messing about in order to get done. There's a thumb screw here which you can pull down, and then that allows you to pull out the fan tray / radiator tray here, and you can remove that really easily. And then you can also put it back in with ease and flip it around the other way if you prefer, so you can choose sort of which way round it faces. I probably end up with it facing the wrong way. You might have spotted that at the beginning of this, but it means that you can put a radiator on there and mount it whichever way round you want. You can also take off that rear tray, which is nice and easy too, and that's useful. And then you have a removable motherboard tray, and this is one of the really nice highlights about this. Same sort of logic as with the Dynamic Evo XL. This makes it really flexible. There are 2 different mounting positions for the motherboard, and this is high mode and low mode. So in high mode, you have it like this, set up a bit further in the case where your motherboard is now mounted up here. In this position, you can only get one 120mm fan mounted at the rear instead of 2 120s or a 240mm radiator, but means you've got more access to the bottom cables. Alternatively, you put it in the low mode, as I've done here, and then you can see you can put 2 fans at the rear or that rad. So that gives you a few more options there. Now the fan tray on the bottom is also removable. That's held in with 2 screws, so it requires a little bit more messing around. There's not an easy thumb screw or anything to do there, but you can take that out and then have easy access to the bottom, and then the mounting is fairly straightforward. A lot of the installation of things is really easy too. SSDs, for example, are a nice breeze. You just have some washers to put on and then some screws that will go on there, and then it will just clip into that tray at the rear, which both hides the cables and allows you to mount multiple SSDs. So you can mount 3 SSDs on here, or alternatively fan controllers and RGB controllers and things like that. So plenty of space for that. This is standard Lian Li setup, and it's very convenient because it's really easy to do, and it's really easy to reposition things, because I found, for example, that I wanted to move that SSD later on and put it further up so that I could then put a fan controller in there instead. But you can see that you could mount 3 SSDs on that tray easily like that, or alternatively you could use the cages. These cages will work with hard disk drives or SSDs, so 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drives, and then they can slot in at the rear, but you don't need to keep them in. You can see that I've shown that you can take them out, so you can remove them, so you can free up space up there for your cables, or just for better flow of air through the system, and nice and straightforward. The motherboard tray also has a big gap at the rear for getting access to the back plate, so that you can install the back plates for your AIO cooler or CPU cooler. But the fact that it's removable means it's really easy to install your motherboard. And for me, it was really easy to show things like where the cables plug in, but that's irrelevant to the average user. But here you can see just how easy it is to take out. And then obviously you can then adjust it into the position that you want afterwards once you've got it back in there. And that flexibility is also useful in a second, and I'll show you why. You can also get these additional rubber grommets, which slot into the holes at the top when it's in low mode. So if you put the motherboard in low mode, obviously you have these gaps here otherwise, but these will just nestle in there to hide that away. Now, it's kind of a shame you don't have rubber grommet areas here where you could thread cables through, because as you'll see with it in low mode, the cables then have to run quite high from that for the top of the motherboard in terms of CPU power, for example, which looks a bit messier in my mind. Not ideal. It would be better if it went straight from the motherboard out, I think. But having it in that low mode gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of what you can do at the rear. So that's one of the trade-offs, and it's a personal thing whether that's going to matter to you or not. The other thing with the 240mm setup, so if you want to put a radiator on the back, you do need to adjust this top PCIe bracket, which is pretty interesting. So when the motherboard's in that low position, you have to basically take this out, flip it over and screw it back in again, and then that gives extra room. If you don't follow this simple step, you won't be able to install the radiator because it seems like it won't fit. And I missed this initially when I was looking at the manual or trying to work out how things worked. So that's something to pay attention to, and it's the little details like that which make it a nice case to build in. But here you can see I've installed the radiator and the motherboard and then just taken the whole thing out. And so you have the ability to take the tray out and maybe mount everything before you even put it into the case, which gives you much easier access to all the different things without messing about inside a case, especially if you've left the glass panels on and you just want to be able to do it more easily. So that's something to bear in mind. The advantage here, though, more importantly, is it makes it much easier to plug the cables in at the bottom, because as you'll see in low mode, there's very little space at the bottom of the case to run the cables out and to then plug them in. So what I did was run them to the bottom and then plug them into the various ports, so front panel USB connections and HD audio, for example, and then position the motherboard back into the case, pushing it down to the bottom, taking care not to squash anything in the process. But this then means that you're not messing about trying to get your fingers into that tiny gap that you can see here. Now, obviously the fan tray on the bottom is removable as well, so theoretically you could take that out too, and that would make life easier as well. So the PSU cover, I wanted to demonstrate some of that. This is a Corsair RM850X, so it's not particularly massive, it's only 850 watts, but you can see how much this would then stick out the rear of the case instead of just mounting into the case and then taking up that extra room. With this power supply unit, actually paid off perfectly, because what you can see here is once you've installed it, those cables are then in a position where they can easily run into the various different loops that are in the case in order to cable tidy. And these hooks are actually really cool as well, and a nice addition to Lian Li's recent cases, because like the SSDs, they basically just slot into place and then push over so they're notched in, and you can reposition them because there's multiple different holes along there. So what I found is I was repositioning them and then also using the Velcro ties that sit on top of them to tidy up cables a bit more. So you have a few different spots where you can put these in and then neaten up your cables. But even if you are messy with your cables, as I often am, there's still plenty of space back here for installing all those things. Not only multiple SSDs, but also your fan controllers and loads of different power cables. And by the end of it, you can still close the door without any troubles. You can see it just shut that tray and then pop the door on, and there was no issues with it bulging out or causing any problems. So ideal way to hide your cable shame, perfectly straightforward. That modularity was once again really useful when I was trying to install the PCIe streamer cables on the bottom of the case and other things, because I noticed they were sort of sitting off to the left a little bit here, as you can see that. So taking out the tray with the fans on it, removing that then gives you easier access, but you can see just how tight it is when it's in that low mode to the bottom. There's very little room to negotiate cables around here, especially with that fan tray in, but even without it, it's still quite tight. So especially because this motherboard for some reason has the USB-A connection on the bottom, but negotiating those cables in, a little bit fiddly, but the flexibility of being able to take the motherboard tray out or the fan tray or both means that you can end up making it a lot easier for yourself. So the end result, I think, is a really nice looking case that's reasonably customizable, but nowhere near as much as the Dynamic Evo XL as an alternative option, though that case is much bigger. It's a lot more flexible in terms of what you can do and how you can mount in it, but still easy to build in, really good looking, good decent airflow for what it is, and a very nice case all round. Another winner from Lian Li.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.